So it's important to go back to the world's first superpower, the British Empire, and think about how they maintained control and compare that to more modern day superpowers during the Cold War and during during now as well, and USA's dominance. So it's important to look at the British Empire to try and get an idea of this. In terms of the syllabus, it's right there. We need to look at an imperial power and we need to compare it to what then came after in terms of bipolar and multipolar powers. But the British Empire was what we call a unipolar power. First thing I'd like you to do in the lesson then, look at this map. It's an interesting map. All the pink areas are the British dominions, the British Empire. This map doesn't actually show the empire at its height. There are maps that show far more of the British dominions, but it's a nice map. And in terms of other things that we can get from it as well, if you just have a think about those questions and put those into your notes at the bottom there. Evidence that suggests it's a superpower, the symbols of power that are on that map, particularly think about the element of racism as well in that map, and the wider issue of racism through the idea of empire. And try and start to think about the mechanisms that Britain used to exert its power and the evidence that you can get from that map. So we're going to start by looking at the British Empire, as I said, by looking at a unipolar world. Okay, if you look at the map at the bottom of this screen here, this is what I was just talking about. This was empire at its height. Okay, so all the purple areas were owned by Britain. Here we have a bipolar world, the US and NATO, and the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. We'll look at those as we get further in the unit. And this map here at the top is the current, arguably, the multipolar world. China and India and the BRICS up there, but USA, Brazil, the Middle East, of course, and the EU there. So what I'd like you to do first is to construct a simple timeline of the mechanisms of power, how Britain maintained its power. You can either do that as a table like we've got there, or just as some notes. I don't really mind. If you open this as a PowerPoint, you'll see in the notes section throughout the presentation there's a load of links, as well as this one here, that give you loads and loads of information about the British Empire. So try and get all those open if you can. So key dates, key events, what were the mechanisms of power? How did the British Empire maintain power? And then evaluate, excuse me, that's my son outside, and then evaluate whether it was a useful way of maintaining power as well. Table or notes, don't mind. So the key things that you should come to is firstly mercantilism, trade routes. The British monarch basically asked a bunch of companies to go out around the world and explore and bring back a load of raw materials. So obviously from that Britain made money. On the other hand, of course, in terms of ignoring the indigenous local people and indigenous tribes and cultures, completely ignored their human rights. But in terms of getting money and getting rich and building empire from that, it was mercantilism that was that first process. Linked to that, of course, is slavery. The movement and the export and import of raw materials is one thing, but of course of humans, that's a complete other. It was the slaves that made these things. It was the slaves that turned these raw materials into things that made Britain rich. Okay, so the slave trade is an extremely important part of how Britain grew its empire and maintained its empire. Technology with the Industrial Revolution in Britain, it gave Britain and other European powers later on as well the ability to make things that were technologically way advanced than any of the things that people in the colonies had. In particular, the Industrial Revolution allowed the empire to mass produce military equipment, guns, muskets, rifles, and the British Army and the armed forces had a massive advantage over every other person in their colonies. So it's really, really important, but also important to realise that it wasn't just Britain that had this technological advantage. Linked to that, the strategic imperatives of having empire. Britain had to bring in new colonies and take over new colonies to protect their existing colonies. So empire was a strategic move as well. A good example of this is India, often called the jewel of empire, and it was so important that the UK had to take over other areas of the world just to have a strategic advantage in terms of protecting India, as important as it was. Later on in the mid-1800s, the Suez Canal, Britain took that over as well, and it meant that they had a strategic advantage in terms of trade, because ships didn't have to go around the Horn of Africa, around southern Africa, in terms of the shipping routes. They could just come through the Mediterranean. Made a huge, huge advantage to the British Empire's trade routes. The Navy, the saying "Britannia rules the waves" came from the fact that the British Navy, the Royal Navy, was by far and away the strongest military force at that point in the whole world. There was not a navy from any other country that could match the Royal Navy. So in terms of military hard power, Britain could protect all its trade routes, it could protect all its dominions, all its colonies, with this massive worldwide Royal Navy that not a single other country could touch. This was shown in a number of naval battles, in particular the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, and it was really that cemented Britain's domination of the seas, communication and trade routes. And it also meant that Britain could take over other countries' colonies as well. The French, Spanish and Dutch colonies all fell to the might of the British, the Royal Navy, at various times in history. So what I'd like you to do is build a little case study, just a page of notes. You can tabulate it if you want, just to make the information a little bit clearer. About India as the main part of that superpower, the superpower of the British Empire. A little bit of history of it. How in particular, though, did Britain maintain control in India? What were the key points? And also think about if there's anything in India that still has remains of colonial status. For instance, cricket is a huge, huge sport in India, and that's to do with the fact that India was a British colony for so long. So just a page of notes, a case study. You can tabulate it, put it in a sort of template in much the same way that you've done with your tectonics case studies as well. Again, all the notes and stuff in the bottom of these slides, and the links will help you with that. Also, in terms of all those links and everything, I also want you just to produce half a page or so of notes, just summarising why Britain eventually fell and failed as a superpower. In particular, expand on the fact that Britain couldn't afford an empire. Why not? The fact that the right of Britain to rule other areas of the world at that point in time in the 20th century was suddenly, well, you know, it's not the done thing. So that sort of cultural and moral angle of empire as well, what happened there, and expand upon the fact that the Royal Navy, particularly after the war, was no longer the force that it once was, and what impact did that have on Britain, British Empire failing. I want you to have a go at this 10-mark question as well. I've put the planning sheet onto Google. It's the same one that you use for the other 10-mark question. Remember, say what you see. Explain why patterns of economic power have changed over time. So go through each stage of the source here. Okay, British Empire here. Why did that change to here, the Cold War era? Why did that then change to US domination in the late 20th century? and early 21st century, and then explain why into the future, what's going to change, India, Japan, China. So some explanations of the changes that go through these 4 points here. Remember, you don't need an introduction, you don't need a conclusion or anything. Say what you see and explain the key points.